The truck's taillights disappeared around the bend before he'd even shouldered his backpack all the way, and then there was nothing. Just the tick of a cooling engine sound that wasn't there anymore, and the wind moving through pines so tall they blotted out most of the sky. He stood at the junction for a long moment, looking at the place where the pavement gave up. The washout had eaten the road's shoulder clean away, a raw gash of red clay and exposed roots, and beyond it the asphalt continued in patches, humped and cracked, disappearing into a corridor of trees. The trucker had been apologetic about it, said his route cut east from here, said sorry kid, said good luck, and it was the good luck that stuck with him now, rolling around in his chest like something with sharp edges. He'd learned not to put much stock in luck. He put stock in daylight, and how much of it was left, and how many miles his boots could cover before it ran out. The road climbed. He walked with his thumbs hooked under his pack straps, watching the forest change around him, aspen giving way to spruce, the air thinning and cooling as the grade steepened. Weeds had pushed up through the asphalt in long green seams, and twice he had to step around fallen branches thick as his leg, silvered with age, undisturbed by any vehicle in longer than he cared to guess. Frostwood was somewhere behind him now, a huddle of gas station and diner and a library he'd meant to visit for the want ads before the ride had come through early. He hadn't planned on this road, nobody had mentioned this road, but it was the only one leading up from where he'd been let off, and going up seemed better than going nowhere. The light was turning that particular amber that meant he had maybe an hour before real dusk set in, and he was starting to think about whether he'd need to bed down somewhere in the trees, when the road took a final curve and the forest opened. He stopped walking. Below him, cupped in a shallow bowl of mountainside, sat a resort, or what had been one. A lodge rose 3 stories at the center of it, its windows dark and some of them broken, its roofline sagging gently under what looked like decades of snow load. Cabins were scattered around it in loose rows, boards nailed crooked over their windows, roofs shaggy with moss. Something like a restaurant sat closer to him, its sign long since faded past reading, and above it all, climbing the mountain in a straight scar through the trees, ran the skeleton of a ski lift, towers leaning, cables slack, chairs hanging motionless like something had simply stopped mid-breath and never started again. No lights. No smoke. No sound but the wind moving through it all. Indifferent, the way it moved through everything up here. He stood there a long time, backpack heavy on his shoulders, watching the shadows pool in the empty windows, and felt something in his chest shift. Not fear exactly, and not hope either. Something closer to recognition. The light was going fast now, the way it did in the mountains, sliding down behind the ridge and taking the color out of everything. He made his way down the last stretch of road, gravel giving way to a cracked apron of asphalt scattered with pine needles and years of fallen branches nobody had bothered to clear. Up close, the lodge looked older and larger both. The porch that wrapped its front sagged in the middle like a tired animal's back. A pair of double doors stood at the top of the steps, one propped half open by debris, the other hanging from a single hinge. He climbed the steps slow, testing each board with his weight before trusting it, and stopped at the threshold. Inside was dark and smelled of dust and cold stone and something faintly sweet underneath it, like rot working patiently on old wood. He waited there, listening. Nothing moved. No animal shifted, no floor creaked under anything but his own boots. Just the wind outside, muffled now, and the settling groan of a building that had been alone a long time. He stepped in. The lobby opened wide around him, ceilings high enough that his flashlight beam got lost before it found them. A reception desk stood off to one side, its surface furred with dust, a rack of keys still hanging behind it, most of them tagged with faded room numbers. Furniture sat draped under sheets that had gone gray and stiff, shapes hunched like sleeping animals. A grand stone fireplace took up most of one wall, cold and black-mouthed, its mantel littered with the husks of dead insects. He moved carefully, sweeping his light low across the floor before he trusted it, checking joists where he could see through gaps in rotted paneling. The wood groaned under him in places but didn't give. Whatever else had failed here, the bones of the place seemed sound. Thick beams, good stone, the kind of building men used to make when they meant it to last. He found the ground floor hallway and walked it slow, passing doors to rooms he didn't open yet. A kitchen he glimpsed through a service door, with everything still arranged as if someone meant to come back and finish a shift that never came. He didn't touch anything, not tonight. Outside, full dark had settled, and the wind had picked up, hissing through the broken windows above him. He thought about the cabins scattered outside, isolated and small, easy to feel trapped in. He thought about the tree line, and how far he was from anyone who'd hear him if something went wrong. The lodge, at least, had size, had exits, had walls thick enough to keep the wind off and doors he could brace if he needed to. He found a narrow staircase near the back of the lobby and started up it, flashlight beam climbing ahead of him into the dark, already thinking about which room might do for the night. The second floor gave onto a corridor lined with doors, most shut, a few hanging open on rooms stripped bare or left half-furnished, beds stacked with mattresses gone soft with damp. He walked the length of it twice, before choosing not the largest room, not the one with the best view down the valley, but the third door on the right, a small corner room with a single window facing east, and a stone fireplace built into the wall like it had been there before the rest of the building grew up around it. The bed frame was intact. The floor didn't sag when he walked it. That was enough. The window was the first problem. 2 panes gone, glass scattered across the sill and the boards below, the frame swollen with old moisture, but not rotted through. He set his pack down, found the flashlight a steady angle against the wall, and went to work by feel more than sight. He'd seen a stack of split lumber down near the maintenance shed on his way in, and scrap boards weren't hard to find in a building this size, loose shelving in a closet down the hall, a broken cabinet door in the room next to his. He measured the gaps with his hands, cut what needed cutting with the folding saw from his kit, and fit the boards into the frame snug enough that the wind quit finding its way through. It wasn't glass. It wasn't pretty. But it held, and holding was the whole of what he needed tonight. The fireplace took longer. Someone had left a mess of old ash, and a bird's nest wedged high in the flue, and he spent a good 20 minutes with a bent length of wire, and his own stubbornness clearing it enough to trust a fire wouldn't back up and choke him in his sleep. He scraped the hearth clean with a flat piece of shingle, stacked what dry wood he could find from a broken chair frame and the boards he'd trimmed off the window job, and struck a match with hands that had gone stiff from the cold. The fire caught slow, then took, and the small orange light filled the room in a way that made it feel less like a ruin and more like a place a person could exist. He sat on the edge of the bare mattress and ate the last of the bread from his pack, chewing slow, listening to the firework and the wind outside working just as hard against the boarded window. Somewhere below him the building creaked, settling into the night the way old buildings did, and he found he didn't mind the sound. It didn't feel like warning. It felt like breathing. He lay back before the fire had died all the way down, boots still on, pack under his arm out of old habit, and let his eyes close on the ceiling above him, water-stained, cracked, but solid. Tomorrow he'd see the rest of it in daylight. Tonight, for the first time in longer than he could easily count, he slept somewhere that was, if only for the moment, his. Morning came thin and gray through the gaps in the boards, and he woke stiff on the bare mattress, with the fire long dead in the grate. He lay there a moment, listening for anything that might have changed in the night. Voices, engines, the sound of someone else laying claim to the place, but there was only wind and the tick of the building cooling and warming with the light. He got up, worked feeling back into his hands, and went out to see what he'd actually found. He started with a notebook he tore the cover off of, figuring he'd need something to keep track of what was worth fixing and what wasn't worth the effort. The guest cabins came first, a row of them strung along a footpath gone soft with moss, each one boarded differently depending on who'd done the work last. Some had held up fine, roofs tight, walls sound underneath the dust. Others had let the weather in through some forgotten gap, and inside he found swollen floorboards, black mold creeping up the walls, insulation sagging out of the ceiling like something wounded. He wrote down which cabins were worth saving and which weren't, numbering them the way he guessed the resort once had, though the little brass numbers were long gone from most of the doors. The restaurant took him the better part of an afternoon. It sat closer to the lodge, big windows now cracked or missing, tables still set up in rows like the last dinner service had simply been abandoned mid-thought. The kitchen was worse, rust eating the stove, a walk-in cooler standing open and empty, shelves of cans swollen and split. But the bones of it were good. Commercial equipment, built to outlast fashion, built heavy. He ran his hand along the stove's cold iron and thought about what it would take to get it breathing again, if there was even gas to feed it. The ski lift was the part that stopped him longest. He followed the line of towers up from the base station, counting them as they climbed the mountain and disappeared into the tree line, cables sagging but mostly intact, chairs swinging faint and rusted in whatever wind found them. He walked the base building, a squat structure of corrugated metal and old wood, and found the machinery inside seized with age but not destroyed. Flywheels, gearboxes, a motor housing big enough to hide in. Nothing here was simple. Nothing here was quick. But none of it struck him as impossible either, and that thought settled into him with a kind of weight he hadn't expected, something between excitement and warning. By the fourth evening his notebook had filled with lists, cabins, roofing, glass, wiring he couldn't yet trace to any source, plumbing that ran dry no matter which valve he turned. He sat on the lodge steps as the light went gold and then gray, looking up the mountain at the lift line vanishing into pine, and wondered what else the place was still keeping from him. The morning came cold and clear, frost silvering the weeds around the maintenance building's door, and he went back to it with the same patience he'd given everything else on the property, slow, methodical, unwilling to force what could be coaxed instead. The building smelled of old grease and mouse nests, of rubber gone brittle and metal gone orange with rust. He'd already gone through the obvious things, the workbenches, the pegboards with their outlines of missing tools, the shelves of oil cans crusted shut. But in the back corner, half hidden behind a stack of collapsed cardboard boxes, stood a metal cabinet bolted to the wall, its handle wrapped in a chain and padlock gone soft with corrosion. He worked at it for the better part of an hour, first with a screwdriver, then with a pry bar he'd found among the seized machinery, wedging it beneath the hasp and leaning his weight into it by degrees. The metal groaned before it gave, and when the lock finally sheared free, he felt it in his shoulders more than his hands, a small violence that seemed almost disrespectful in a place this quiet. He paused before opening it, the way he might have paused at a door in someone else's house, then told himself the resort had no one left to ask permission of, and pulled it open. Inside were shelves of paper, undisturbed by weather but not by time, stacks of maintenance journals bound in cracked leather, their pages gone the color of weak tea, filled with a cramped, practical handwriting logging lift repairs, snowpack measurements, cabin inspections going back further than he'd guessed the resort had existed. Beneath them, rolled and tied with brittle twine, were property maps, larger and more detailed than anything he'd found in the lodge office. He unrolled the topmost one on the workbench, weighting the corners with tools, and traced the resort's boundary lines with his finger: the lodge, the cabins, the restaurant, the lift line climbing the mountain in careful, surveyed strokes. It was the second map, folded smaller and tucked behind the others as if someone had wanted it kept apart, that stopped him. The hand that had drawn it was different, looser, more personal, less concerned with scale than with memory. It showed the same mountain, the same lift line, but continuing past where the official maps ended, a thin dotted trail climbing higher through what was labeled only as timber, no contour lines, no legend, just a single small square, far above the resort, marked in faded ink, Upper Lodge. He held the map close to the window light, studying the trail's switchbacks, the places where it forded a creek, the rough compass rose scratched in one corner. Nothing in the office plans had shown this. Nothing in the deed or the property survey he'd flipped through his first week mentioned any structure beyond the lift's summit terminal. He folded the map along its old creases, careful not to tear the softened paper, and looked north through the dusty window toward the tree line where the lift cables vanished, wondering what kind of building could sit forgotten above a resort that was already forgotten itself. He spent the rest of that evening studying the map by lamplight, tracing the dotted line with his finger until he had the switchbacks memorized, the creek crossing fixed in his mind like something he'd walked before. Sleep came late and thin. By the time gray light found the window, he was already dressed, a coil of rope over one shoulder, the hatchet from the maintenance shed hanging from his belt, a canteen and a few strips of jerked meat from his dwindling stores tucked into the pack he hadn't unpacked since arriving. The trailhead was easy enough to find once he knew to look for it, a gap in the brush behind the lift's summit terminal, marked by an old blaze cut into a pine that had long since scarred over into a lump of bark. Past that, the trail existed more in suggestion than fact. Deadfall crossed it in places where whole trees had toppled and lain rotting for years, their trunks soft enough that his boot sank through the bark when he tried to step over. He cut where he had to, hauled branches aside where cutting wasn't needed, and marked his own trail behind him with strips of orange cloth torn from a ruined curtain, in case the fog rolled in the way it had twice already since he'd come to the mountain. The climb was steady but unrelenting, the kind that made a man's legs remember every mile of it the next morning. He crossed the creek where the map said he would, boulder to boulder, the water low and clear and cold enough to numb his fingers when he cupped a drink from it. Above the creek, the pines grew taller and closer together, blotting out enough sky that the temperature dropped, and the light turned the color of dusk, even at midday. He found himself listening more than looking, the way he had in the woods behind the last group home he'd run from, ears tuned to anything that wasn't wind or his own breath. It took most of the morning and half the afternoon to cover what the map called 2 miles, though it felt longer, the trail vanishing under generations of needlefall and reappearing only when he found the next blaze scar or the next place where the ground had been leveled by hands long gone. Twice he lost it entirely and had to backtrack, retracing his own orange markers until the pattern of the old path revealed itself again, faint as a memory trying to surface. By late afternoon, the trees thinned just enough to let a shaft of gold light through, and he stopped, chest working, sweat cooling fast in the mountain air. Ahead, where the pines opened into a small shelf of level ground, something pale and man-made broke the line of the forest. A wall, weathered silver gray, standing where no wall should have been. He came out of the trees slow, the way he'd learned to come out of anything unfamiliar, letting his eyes adjust before his feet committed. The wall belonged to a lodge, smaller than the one he'd been sleeping in but built with the same care, hewn logs fitted tight and capped with a shake roof, gone silver with age but largely intact, no gaps of daylight showing through like the guest cabins down below. A stone chimney rose from one end, cold and dry. Windows, shuttered from inside, faced the shelf of open ground like closed eyes. He circled it once before touching anything, the habit of a boy who'd learned that empty places sometimes weren't. The front door was set with a simple slide bolt, not even locked, and when he worked it free and pushed, the hinges gave with a groan but no resistance, swollen wood rather than rust. Inside, the air hit him first, dry, still, faintly resinous, the smell of a place sealed against weather rather than abandoned to it. Dust hung where the light came through the door, but underneath it the room was orderly. A workbench ran along one wall, hand tools hung on pegboard in shapes still traced by grime, outlines of wrenches and planes and things he didn't have names for. 2 generators sat bolted to a concrete pad in the corner, cased in canvas tarps gone stiff, and beyond them a bank of galvanized water tanks, dented but whole. He moved through it the way he'd moved through the maintenance building weeks before, cataloging without touching, letting the place tell him what it was before he decided what to do with it. A second room held a cot frame, a wood stove, a shelf of canned goods so old the labels had faded to ghosts of print, and against the back wall, stacked 3 high and covered in a canvas drop cloth gone brittle at the folds, were wooden crates. He knelt and pulled the cloth back carefully, the way he'd have handled something alive. Inside the first crate, photographs, hundreds of them, black and white and early color both, curling at the edges but preserved by the dry air and the dark. He lifted one out. A man in work clothes, standing in front of this same lodge, younger trees behind it, the timber pale and new. Another showed a woman and 2 children on the shelf of ground outside, a mule loaded with lumber. Another, taken from higher up the mountain, showed the valley below, not the ruin he'd found, but a scatter of foundations, the bones of the resort, not yet grown into itself. He sat back on his heels in the dust and the fading light, the photograph still in his hand, and understood he was holding the beginning of something he'd only ever seen the end of. He carried the crates down one at a time, cradling them against his chest like something that might shatter if he jarred it, and by the time the light had gone fully purple over the ridge, he had them arranged on the floor of the upper lodge's main room, lantern hissing on an overturned bucket beside him. He told himself he would look at a few and then start back down, before dark caught him on the trail. He did not move for 2 hours. The journals were easier to read than he'd expected, the handwriting square and patient, a man's hand used to figures and measurements more than prose. Early entries were dated in the spring of a year decades gone, and they read like the record of a man building something out of stubbornness as much as money. Lumber hauled up by mule before the road was cut, a generator ordered from a catalog and carried in pieces on someone's back. notes on frost dates and water pressure and the depth needed for a proper footing in mountain ground. Somewhere in the second journal the handwriting loosened, grew almost cheerful, and Caleb understood that was when the lodge below had gone up in earnest, when the dream had stopped being a single cabin in the trees and become a resort with a name. He found the name written in careful letters on the inside cover of the third journal, underlined twice, and something in his chest tightened at seeing it fixed to a person instead of a ruin. The photographs filled in what the journals left dry. A woman standing at a window that Caleb realized with a small jolt was the same window in the room he now called his own. Children older in each crate, then a wedding, then a photograph of a man alone on the lodge steps, gray now, looking at the camera with an expression Caleb couldn't name but recognized anyway, because he'd worn it himself outside gas stations at dusk. The later entries in the last journal grew sparse. A bad season, a bank letter mentioned but not quoted, a final page, half a paragraph, breaking off mid-sentence about repairs that would have to wait until spring, a spring the ledger never reached. Caleb sat with that unfinished sentence a long while, lantern guttering low, and felt the 15 years since pressed down on him like weight through a roof. He knew nothing of what came after, who bought it, who let it go, why a family's whole labor could be handed off and forgotten inside a single generation. But he knew the shape of it now, the way he knew the shape of a wall from studying its cracks. Someone had built this out of nothing, the same as he was trying to now, and someone had lost it anyway. He closed the journal gently, as if it might still object, and looked out at the dark shapes of the generators waiting in the corner, patient as the mountain itself, for someone to finally need them again. The generators became his obsession over the next several days. He hauled tools down from the upper lodge in careful loads, wrapping the more delicate instruments in flannel from a crate he'd found half full of rags, walking the 2 miles slow so nothing rattled loose in his pack. He studied the wiring diagrams tucked behind the second generator's access panel, penciled by a hand he now recognized from the journals, and matched them against what he found snaking through the main lodge's walls when he pried open an old junction box in the basement. It was not simple work. Half the wiring had corroded past saving, and he spent 2 days just tracing which lines still had continuity, testing with a borrowed multimeter whose battery he'd resurrected by scraping corrosion from its terminals with a pocket knife. He learned the resort's bones the way he'd learned every structure he'd ever slept in, by necessity, by trial, by the quiet stubbornness of a man who could not afford to fail twice. The smaller generator was the one he chose to bring back first, a portable unit meant for outbuildings, light enough that he and a come-along winch could drag it down the mountain trail on a sled built from cabin decking. It took him a full day to get it positioned behind the lodge, another to flush its fuel system and replace a cracked gasket with one he'd fashioned from a rubber mat cut to shape. When he finally primed it and pulled the cord, it coughed, sputtered, died. He adjusted the choke, cleaned the plug, tried again. On the 4th pull it caught and held, rattling to life with a sound that seemed to shake the whole hillside awake. He ran a line in through the basement window he'd already patched, up through the old conduit to the 2nd floor, and wired it careful and slow to a single outlet in his room and one bare bulb in the hallway outside it. When he flipped the switch that evening, the bulb flared yellow and steady, and light spilled down the corridor for the first time in 15 years. He stood there a long moment, not moving, the generator's hum coming faint through the floorboards like something breathing beneath the house. It was such a small thing, one bulb, one outlet, and yet it felt larger than anything he'd built since arriving, larger than the fireplace, or the patched window, or the cleared trail. It felt like the building agreeing to keep going. He turned the light off to save fuel, then turned it back on just to see it again, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for longer than he could easily remember. Somewhere above him in the dark, the rest of the lodge waited, room after room still cold and silent, still his to wake. The next morning he carried the same patient logic into the restaurant. The old stove sat against the back wall like a rusted animal, its burners caked with grease gone hard as stone, its pilot line cracked where mice had gnawed the rubber down to threads. He took it apart the way his foster father had taught him to take apart anything he didn't understand, piece by piece, laid out in order on a clean sheet of newspaper so nothing got lost or forgotten. The gas line from the upper lodge's spare fittings fit close enough that a little grinding and a wrap of tape made it true. He cleaned the burners with a wire brush until the metal showed silver again, replaced the cracked line with copper tubing salvaged from the maintenance building, and on the third try the pilot caught with a soft cough and held. He stood there watching the blue flame steady itself, thinking of all the meals that stove must have cooked once, the noise and steam and shouted orders that had filled this room before it went quiet. He worked the cabins next, racing the season now. The nights had grown a bite to them, and frost silvered the grass some mornings when he woke, and he knew what that meant for a roof already weak. He climbed onto the nearest cabin with a coil of rope and a bundle of shingles pulled from a pile the maintenance shed had somehow kept dry, and he replaced what had rotted through, board by board, nail by nail, testing each new section with his boot before trusting his weight to it. He did this for 6 cabins in as many days, moving from one to the next like a man working down a list only he could see, patient with the parts that fought him and grateful for the ones that didn't. The trails took longer than anything else, because there was no fixing them in an afternoon, only clearing, a little more each day, brush and deadfall, and the slow crowding return of the forest pushed back inch by inch. He cut where he could, dragged where he couldn't cut, and marked the path with stacked stones where the old signs had rotted away entirely. Some evenings his hands shook from the effort of it, and he'd sit on a stump and eat cold beans from the can and watch the light go gold and then gray over the mountain, and think that 6 weeks ago he hadn't owned a single thing that couldn't fit in a backpack, and now there was a whole property that seemed, slowly, without his quite noticing when it happened, to be leaning against him rather than the other way around. He didn't let himself dwell on it too long. There was still the ballroom's broken windows, still half the guest rooms untouched, still the tramway itself rusted silent above the tree line, and the season, he knew, would not wait for him to finish. It happened on a Tuesday, though he only knew that because he'd started keeping a calendar in pencil on the inside of the closet door, a habit picked up from the maintenance journals without meaning to copy them. He was on the roof of the third guest cabin, straddling the ridge line with a bundle of split shakes beside him, when he heard the engine, a sound so foreign after 6 weeks of birds and wind and his own hammer that it took him a moment to place it as a vehicle at all, climbing the gravel switchbacks below the lodge. He set down the hatchet and watched a dust-colored sedan nose around the last bend, low to the ground, clearly not built for the road it was on. It stopped in the weed-choked lot he'd cleared just enough to walk through, and 2 people got out. A man in a collared shirt too clean for the mountain air, and a woman a step behind him with her arms crossed against the cold, both of them looking up at the lodge the way people look at something they'd been told was a ruin and were surprised to find standing. Caleb's first thought was that this was it, the thing he'd half expected every day since the first night he'd broken into the fireplace flue, someone come to tell him to get off land that wasn't his. He climbed down the ladder slower than he needed to, giving himself the length of it to settle his breathing, to remind himself he'd done nothing here he was ashamed of. He'd taken nothing that wasn't already going to rot into the mountain. He'd fixed more than he'd used. By the time his boots hit the ground, the man had already started toward the lodge steps, and the woman had turned and spotted him standing there with a hatchet loose in one hand and sawdust down the front of his shirt, and gone very still. "Somebody in town said there was a man living up here," the woman said. Not quite a question, not quite an accusation, her eyes moving past him to the cabin roof, the new shakes pale against the weathered gray, the window glass catching sun where for 15 years there'd only been plywood and dark. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said, because there was no version of the truth that helped him to say otherwise. "I have been, since early September." The man had stopped on the lodge steps, one hand on the newly rehung door, looking at the hinge like he didn't recognize it, like he was trying to remember whether it had always swung that easy. "This is our property," the woman said carefully, as if testing whether he already knew that, or whether she was about to have to explain something that would make him run. "I know," Caleb said. "I figured somebody'd come eventually." He set the hatchet down against the cabin wall, slow, both hands visible, the way you moved around something wild that hadn't decided yet whether to bolt. "I can show you what I've done, if you want to see it before you decide anything." The woman looked at the man, and the man looked at the door hinge a moment longer before he let go of it, and something passed between them that Caleb had seen before in other rooms, other kitchens, the silent arithmetic couples did when they'd been braced for one thing and found another. They walked the property with him through the last gold hour of the afternoon. He showed them the lodge room with its patched window and swept hearth, the restaurant kitchen with its clean stove and stacked cordwood, the cabins with new roofs holding against weather that would have rotted the old ones through by Christmas. He showed them the maintenance building, the journals returned neatly to their cabinet, the maps unrolled and weighted flat on the workbench. He watched the woman's hands go still over the ledger pages, the man's mouth work without sound when he came to a photograph of a young couple standing in front of a lodge that didn't exist yet, just framing and sky behind them. "That's her," the woman said finally, quiet. "That's my aunt. I never met her. She died before I was born." She looked up at Caleb like she was seeing him fully for the first time, not as a trespasser, but as something closer to a caretaker of things she hadn't known were lost. "You found all this yourself." "Found the trail in the maintenance shed," Caleb said. "Rest was just walking it." They stood a long while in the upper lodge, as the light slanted gold through the timber walls, the generators silent but oiled and ready, the crates of photographs stacked where he'd left them, waiting for hands that had a right to them. Nobody spoke of leaving. Nobody spoke of trespassing anymore. It was the man who finally said it, turning from the window with the mountain going purple behind him. "We can't run this place from 3 states away. Never could. That's half of why it sat 15 years. He looked at his wife, who nodded before he'd finished asking her with his eyes. "We need somebody up here, somebody who already knows it better than we do." Caleb didn't answer right away. He thought of the washed-out junction, the weeds swallowing the road, the cold first night with the wind coming through a broken window. He thought of 6 weeks of small repairs, one board and one wire at a time, done for no reason except that the place had needed doing and he'd had nowhere else to be. "I'd stay," he said, "if you'll have me." The woman smiled, and it reached all the way up into her eyes. "The room upstairs," she said. "The one you already fixed. Seems only right it stays yours." Below them, the ski lift cables creaked once in the wind, patient, unhurried, like something old finally settling into rest. Caleb looked out at the mountain, at the lodge lights he had wired himself, and understood, for the first time in years, that he was looking at home.